All right, good morning. Hello to everybody who's here today, and hello to anybody who might be watching online. My name is Travis again. Really excited to be here. So I am a City of Calgary employee. I am a senior transportation engineer with the City of Calgary. And I have a fair bit of history working in transportation. For the most part, transportation planning. Absolutely. So with that experience in primarily network planning, forecasting, a lot of work in strategy and policy, also some time spent in operations and maintenance and transportation infrastructure delivery. But for the last couple of years, I've also been a representative to the Urban Robotics Foundation on behalf of the City of Calgary. And it's in that capacity, really, that I'm here to speak today. And it's on the topic of, thank you, Jason, public area mobile robots, PMRs. And are we ready to share the sidewalk with robots? Which is a great question. And I should maybe first just point out, we've got some pictures here on this title that aren't from Calgary. So notwithstanding our logo, we've got in the upper left imagery from Toronto from 2021 or 2022. And then we have imagery from the United States. I can't remember exactly which campus, potentially more recent, but Starship operating on campus. So not exactly a fully public area, but these are both, I thought, pretty interesting images and sort of representative of what we're here to talk about. I mentioned the Urban Robotics Foundation, and this is a very busy slide, but I really wanted to make sure that I was clear about sort of who they are, what they are, why we're involved with them. As it's noted, you know, it was founded a few years ago. It's a global membership-funded nonprofit organization bringing together people from all of the different fields related to public mobile area robots. Robot manufacturers, representatives of municipalities like myself, but also groups like the Toronto Zoo, for example, and a lot of different parties, basically to work together to help promote understanding of the challenges and the requirements for accommodating and managing public area mobile robots. This is something that we know is coming. Technology is developing. We'll get into that as I go along. But this group has come together or has been developed to help advance the knowledge and help facilitate. And it's a great group. So my initial involvement was at the request of Bern Grush, who's who is sort of the lead and the global expert on public area mobile robots, especially as it relates to the development of this technical standard, ISO 4448 for public area mobile robots. And so for the first year or so, I was involved in discussions around the development of the standard. And eventually, over time, that standard, by the way, just got published this year officially. Over time, the work on this sort of developed further and coalesced into the Urban Robotics Foundation. It expanded beyond simply developing and delivering this standard. And so we therefore ended up joining the Urban Robotics Foundation, and the work is broadened out into a number of areas, which I'll talk about today. Here are three of the sort of products, the most obvious products that have come out of the Urban Robotics Foundation. The first two are available now, and the last one, I believe, is in development. So an executive guide to PMRs, basically just helping people in a position of decision making around utilization of capital and resources, and sort of those who are deciding whether to move forward with PMRs. And then also we have the discovery guide to PMRs, which is really a larger document which is intended to help inform and support municipalities and local government as they look at PMRs and how they may be deployed and what we might be addressing. And in that respect, I was actually part of the editorial board for that publication with editorial support. And then regulatory guide to PMRs, which is in development and should be available in 2025. which will help with preparing bylaws and regulations for public area mobile robots. All right, what are public area mobile robots? I have to admit, when I first thought about this subject, not knowing anything else about it, sidewalk robots sounds pretty cool. My thoughts went to Star Wars immediately, and I was thinking about that one on the left there running around in front of the stormtroopers in the Death Star, thinking, okay, that's going to be great, but let's hopefully not trip over them. And then, of course, thought, well, at the same time, how are we going to be interacting with these things? And the thought came to mind, Johnny 5, I think it was, from Short Circuit from the 1980s. It's probably not exactly what a lot of the robot providers are thinking about, but nonetheless, this is sort of where it went. But there's some aspects of this which kind of, speak to what you're getting into in the dynamic when you're talking about public area mobile robots. They can move, they're public. So let's delve into that a little bit. This is, and I think it'll launch for me. This is a really good video that Starship, one of the I guess, robot providers that are sort of the largest, have the largest deployed fleet in North America, particularly in the US. This is a little video that they did sort of speaking to what a day in the life of one of their public area mobile robots looks like. And so I'm gonna play this. It's not very long, but I thought it was really illuminating in terms of how are these integrating into daily lives within a community? What's actually happening? What does it look like? And so I think this does a really good job. So we'll just play this. All right, thanks for indulging me there with that. But I think as I go along and we talk a bit more about some of the different impacts and the different points of interaction that these robots have with the public environment, that will help set the stage a little bit for some of them, and it'll make it easier for me to illustrate them. So as we get into the more formal definition of a public area mobile robot, this comes from the technical standard, but wheeled or legged or ambulatory ground-based device that is designed to travel along public shared active transportation pathways without the use of visible human assistance or physical guides. All right. There's a number of different components to that. I'll break them down as we go forward, but here's a few different examples from around the world. We've got some kind of more police type PMR on the left bottom. In the middle, I'm not sure exactly what the purpose of that one is. I think it might just be some type of maintenance bot. And then on the right, something I've actually seen here in Calgary. One of the first things I ever encountered in Calgary actually of this type was a cleaning robot similar to the one on the lower right in the Palliser complex when I was at working for transportation infrastructure. So it's not that these things haven't been here before. What does that look like in the bigger picture? I'm borrowing here figures and pictures from the Urban Robotics Foundation, but I think this is particularly helpful and just in terms of trying to identify, we have the larger community or population of robots generally. This would include all the different kinds of robots that you would typically think about: manufacturing, production robots, stationary robots, you name it. Then we move into a subset that are mobile, the ones that can move under whatever control, but they can move around. Within that subset, we get down to the nitty-gritty of public area mobile robots. And then finally, within that, there's a subset of personal delivery devices, which are the type of PMRs that most people are familiar with, the ones that we tend to think of first. And so I've shown 3 examples here of public area mobile robots. Upper left, we've got somebody who's utilizing it for mobility support or assistance. That's in an airport setting. Upper right, we have a form of snow and ice control. At lower right, we have a sweeping robot. And at the bottom left, in personal delivery devices, we actually have a food delivery robot, and we'll talk more about that one. I think this is a really powerful photo. I'm always impressed by it. So how are we defining PMRs again? Well, they're defined by where and how they're being deployed. So obviously, they're operating in the public realm or the semi-public realm. And what does that mean? Well, public realm would be, outside on the street, the actual right-of-way, sidewalk primarily, right? Curb space and such. Semi-public realm gets into the area where it may be owned by somebody else, but it still is integrated and it functions like it feels like a public realm. So it could be the entrance to their building, right? It could be a courtyard. In some cases, the semi-public realm could be a university campus, which feels pretty open. You and I could go and walk there, but it's not actually, operated by the city, for example. So it's a semi-public realm, feels like a public realm. And these robots are intended to operate within that area. They operate amongst bystanders. This is really key, right? They are intended to be able to operate freely on the street. And they're going to have interactions as a result. And finally, they operate without reliance on physical guides. So, it's not like we've got magnets buried under the sidewalk and they're following, missing rails or anything. Like, these are actually operating fairly autonomously. They're using technology to understand where they are and to make decisions on how to react in response to the information that they are sensing around their environment. Like I said, this is an interesting photo, and as I understand it from the information, it was taken by a member of the Urban Robotics Foundation, and the person walking the dog wasn't even necessarily aware that the PMR was there, which is pretty interesting and can become important, and I'll show an example later. So they're ground-based. They operate with wheels or legs. I don't have a Boston Robotics example here, but if you've seen their sort of virtual dog-type robots, you'll have an idea of what it could also look like. And we're not talking about drones, aerial drones here, so this isn't anything to do with that. Like I said, they're operating in public and semi-public spaces, and no visible operator. So it's not like there's a minder there with them. There's not somebody that's come along with them, that's watching them or actually operating them. Like, these are designed to operate in place with autonomous or semi-autonomous systems, or possibly being teleoperated at a distance, but not with somebody right there. Okay, so that does make it different. If something goes wrong, there isn't somebody immediately there to solve the problem in that physical space. They can be remotely operated, as I mentioned. They can carry humans as passengers. And they can also be electronically tethered to follow a human, which is an interesting concept. And that's another example picture I'll show after. So here's a slide showing a number of different delivery PMRs. And so some of these may look familiar. The upper left is Starship, which is what we watched on the video. We also have FedEx and Prime PMRs, which were part of projects and programs that were in place. Actually, in the case of FedEx and Prime, both of those have actually come to a halt or been scaled back, as is the want with technology on the bleeding edge. Some things move forward, some things stop, some things go backwards. And then at the upper right, we have something that was actually on the streets of Vancouver just at the end of 2022, delivering Pizza Hut, I think on Robson Street. There was a couple of these units And all of them are represented at the bottom in terms of relative size to a human. In this case, a human male. I can't say exactly what the size of the human was, but you can basically assume that Starship will take you out at the knees. Just kidding. But it's about up to that height. But then you can go from that, which could be 50 pounds, let's say, all the way up to something on the order of maybe 250 pounds. And so, they scale in terms of size and payloads. Other potential use cases for PMRs. I mentioned the Follow Me robot. Upper right-hand illustration is something of an example of that. So, this thing follows you around and basically brings your stuff, and, it's almost like a backpack of sorts, but it's smarter than that in theory. But there's a lot of application areas potentially. So we've got, as I mentioned, mobility assistance, asset inspections, asset maintenance, cleaning and snow and ice control, parking management is a possibility, security certainly, presence monitoring, waste removal, personal service robots, as I mentioned, visitor information and wayfinding. These are all potential applications for robots that are capable of the type of functions that we've discussed. And some of these functions already occur, but not in public or semi-public spaces. In private sense, in companies, there are inspection and security robots already that are operating, but those are within private property, within boundaries. So what is driving PMR deployment? Why is it becoming relevant now? Obvious is technological advancements in robotics and autonomous vehicles. But there's also growth in the robot market generally. Really terrific growth, actually, with enormous projections. Growth in e-commerce. This isn't a surprise to anybody. We buy a lot of stuff online. That is only growing. Canadians are happy to buy online as anybody. So that commerce is huge. There's a lot of money there. But we also see, and this is in part a result of the growth in e-commerce, growth in on-street retail delivery vehicle traffic. There are a lot of Amazon and other vehicles running around making deliveries, and everybody sees that every day, right? It's a real growth area. And it comes with impacts, emissions, contributions to congestion. So, this is something that we may not want to necessarily encourage, or at least we may want to look at alternatives and other ways of delivering goods. There's been interest in contactless delivery since the pandemic. That interest hasn't entirely gone away. There's transformation in retail distribution networks. So the old model of going to bricks and mortar stores is changing. And we're not building malls everywhere now so that everybody can go and have it's the same mall experience all over the place. We know that in a lot of cases, major retailers are moving away from being everywhere to having boutique locations that allow you to come and try on their experience, try on or customize your order, and then have it delivered after the fact. Again, more reliance on e-commerce. We also know that distribution networks are changing. There is a push and an interest in creating more community-oriented distribution networks. So taking advantage in some cases of the very change in bricks and mortar and mall turnovers, redevelopments into community distribution centers, another notch down from like the big distribution centers we're familiar with, local warehousing, local distribution within communities. This is happening, and we'll see more and more of that. PMRs are a part of that picture because PMRs can be deployed at a local distance for last mile delivery. If you're going to push your distribution network into communities, PMRs actually allow you to accomplish last mile deliveries from, to a certain degree, from where you are already going to be and where you can take a vehicle and then deploy from that vehicle. So they're part of the bigger picture. A lot of opportunities. This comes from the Urban Robotics Foundation, but I'll just focus here primarily on the municipal column. We know there are underserved areas. Things like grocery store deserts are real things. There's a lot of potential data-driven insights to be realized. These things are nothing if not good for providing or at least generating data, obviously subject to appropriate requirements for data reporting and data sharing. As someone who's worked a lot in transportation modeling, you're always looking for agents that you can send through a network to send you back good data on how networks are performing. These have that possibility. As someone who's worked in transportation operations and snow and ice control, and as I pointed out to a panel discussion once, these kinds of robots can give you useful data on traction, how are their wheels spinning. And in Sweden, for example, they would actually even use a form of optical or laser detector or sensor to help with that information, provide that information. And then even public safety or public cleanliness. These are potentially subject to a lot of other considerations. The PMRs could provide function not only in cleaning the streets, but a presence, right? Imagine the opportunity if you needed for somebody to basically, like we have for security on LRT platforms or around station areas. These types of robots provide the potential for that, but not in one place, right? And a lot of other opportunities. So just a very quick example of PMRs in the real world. What does it look like when we've deployed these things? This is just a brief video. You may have seen this before. So that's sort of, I think, a fairly well-known clip of a delivery robot attempting to go right through the middle of a Los Angeles police taped-off scene. Oblivious. They let it through. Well, actually, that's what amazed me. They didn't bother trying to actually interfere with it. If the video continued, you'd see it go down the street and everybody move out of the way and hold up police tape and everything. So people actually defer to these things a fair bit. But this is part of trials and tribulations. So this is, what does it look like when they're on the street and they haven't encountered everything? Let's talk more about Canada. How it started. In 2021, Jeffrey, the pink delivery robots were deployed in Toronto. A lot of interest, a lot of attention. I think a lot of people like them from what I've read. They became quite notable. Not too long after, Toronto City Council ultimately voted to ban, they call them pavement robots here, it's not really the right way to refer to them, but they ultimately ended up voting to ban them, at least for now, on an interim basis. And I'll talk about what some of those reasons were. But so we've had some false starts, let's say. And actually this was similar to what occurred in Ottawa. And I think in part it was Tiny Mile, I believe, is the company that supplied the robots. A bit of an aggressive approach on their part. Let's get these things on the street and see what happens. Didn't turn out as well as probably they hoped, but I'll give them credit for trying. Notwithstanding that, however, though, we've had some other great examples. So I mentioned pizza delivery in Vancouver. So this occurred later, so it had the benefit of more the learned experience from, say, Toronto and Ottawa. It was a trial. It was upfront. They were clear this was a trial. It's not going to happen for very long. A lot of controls on it, and it was only 2 robots. But more recently, and this is something I think which is really important to highlight, note the date on this, October 2nd, 2024. So here is an example of fully autonomous PMR robots being deployed at the Toronto Zoo. And they're actually going to be delivering meals, the food, for animals within the zoo grounds. And so it's a semi-public space, a little bit safer environment, controlled location. Toronto Zoo is part of the URF, and so is the robotics company. So it's maybe an example of a trial done the right way. And so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Lots of challenges that have to be addressed when PMRs show up or are accommodated. Public acceptance, traffic orchestration, how do you manage them? Obviously regulatory frameworks, data privacy, once we start talking about data. Safety concerns, to say the least. Liability management. We say these things only go as far as the insurance companies are comfortable letting them go. So I always watch the insurance companies. Cybersecurity, issues around infrastructure readiness. This gets more to the point of what went wrong with the Toronto and Ottawa sort of initiatives. The CNIB, who is a member as well of the Urban Robotics Foundation, felt it necessary to get involved and intervene in a way. Intervenes, maybe there's the wrong word, but to make a clear statement on their concern about the risks to vulnerable street users as a result of these devices moving around, and the fact that it hadn't been clearly addressed. And ultimately, you know, their position and others in that sort of line led to Toronto City Council banning the operation on the streets for a period of time, pending further study. And what it really speaks to is, you know, we can't forget that the public space that is there is for people first, and everything else has to revolve around that. And we have fought, in a way, with ourselves for decades in terms of defining the right balance between providing for automobiles, providing for vehicles, but also not forgetting that the street at the end of the day serves people, right? And active modes, people in the active modes planning profession will tell you that hard-fought gains to make sure that the public realm is there and properly planned and available in an equitable way. And so anything we introduce to it is competing for space and is introducing conflict. And if we do that and we haven't thought through or considered, you know, sort of the highest risks to vulnerable users and to others, then we really we're not prepared. We haven't done this right. We haven't done our homework. And this is what I think the CNIB has pointed out, among others. And so it's a good example of, you know, being hasty creates waste, to say the least. There's other things that we have to consider. I believe this is from the United States, but we've got examples where, you know, they're still learning how to interact, these PMRs, or at least the programming and the programmers. And so here's an example where they're blocking, you know, the accessible sidewalk ramps. People will walk around them. People, again, are actually, to a large degree, very willing to be flexible with these things in the environment. They're novel, but we have to remember, like, they're actually blocking space that's there for people who need these ramps. We need to address this. Public interactions. This is interesting. You see a range. I'll maybe address the most interesting one at the lower left. This is actually a YouTube video. You can go and watch it. But in this particular case, a gentleman was walking his dog. Dog's off leash. That may or may not be allowed in that particular area. Robot's coming towards them. The robot changed direction. The dog was started. He was upset by it. The gentleman's response was to kick the robot over. Didn't appreciate its presence, didn't appreciate the interaction with his animal. In other examples, more benign examples, we have at the top center pedestrians pressing the walk button for robots because they can't do it themselves. We have at that same or similar corner to the one I showed you earlier, we had a robot get stuck on the curb. People are like, yeah, let me help you out. And then the bottom shows it's actually from an event that was held, I believe, to help sort of engage people on PMRs and what they felt about them, you know, solicit information. But what it shows is a lot of kids like to interact with PMRs because, as you notice, a lot of the robot manufacturers will put faces and, you know, sort of anthropomorphize them, if you will. And so we know that they kind of get drawn to them, and that can be a good and a bad thing at the same time. So public interactions and understanding and thinking about that become important. Utilization of space. If you're a municipality and you decide to allow PMRs onto your streets, you also have to think about, you know, how are they going to organize themselves? When we have a crosswalk and people have to wait to cross the street, people generally sort themselves out. It's one of the things we learn earliest in life is how to work with others and stay out of the way and, you know, be aware of others' needs. PMRs are still learning this in terms of the programming. So how do you organize them, or what's necessary to ensure that they'll be good participants in street life? An example here, obviously, it's not so bad when you've only got one PMR on the corner and you might tell it to stay out of the way. And then you get three and they all want to cross the street and they're lined up, effectively blocking the sidewalk at that point, which is unacceptable. You get more PMRs, and now you've got to decide where do you want them to go, and if there's curb drops there on the left, you've got sort of a wall of PMRs in the way. But I mean, don't get me wrong, people will stand there too, but people will move out of the way, right? PMRs would have to do the same. And I have to admit, when I see that image, it always reminds me of those gang boxes for newspapers that we used to have, and the space that they would take up at the corners, which, if you notice, are completely gone now, right? Big deal 10, 15 years ago, now completely gone. And which also speaks to my sort of opinion that in some ways PMRs are kind of like if you took newspaper box and you threw in a little bit of a, Dyson robot vacuum and maybe a bird scooter, you've got this combination of things going on. I said Dyson, like it's a smart vacuum I'd be throwing in there. But otherwise, again, on the other example, you've got a variety, and they're moving around and they're allowing space through. So what kind of behavior do you need to request or require in terms of how these things socialize? Because you're going to get into situations where they're going to move in packs, right? And we see this behavior with couriers. We see this behavior with the FedExes of the world coming out. I live, in the north part of town. I see them coming out from their distribution centers at the airport all the time. They'll be FedEx, Pure Later. Right? And it's not a bad thing, but this is we could have something like that happening on our sidewalks, right? So we have to think about this, or even just simply parking. Where do we park these? It's no different in that sense than scooters. Where do we want them? Are they creating obstacles? Is that the best use of that space? These are things we have to think about. So in terms of regulatory considerations, I've just listed a number here. This is not a comprehensive list. And again, if you're looking for that, I would direct you towards the Urban Robotics Foundation's materials. But data sharing, obviously a permitting framework that has to incorporate enforcement. Again, I'm thinking of newspaper boxes because we used to have to enforce and permit those. Spatial restrictions, time of day, congestion responsive. Are there places we don't want them at certain times? And we have that around the world with cars. There's nothing to say that when you consider the limited capacity for sidewalks to accommodate humans as well as wheeled vehicles, we may have to do the same. Payload restrictions, dangerous goods, where do you want dangerous goods? Performance specifications, protocols for how they deal with breakdowns, safety, parking in the public realm. Other operational considerations, identification of preferred or designated routes. There may be places we want them. Adverse environmental conditions, obviously, and as you can see, this is an example of a Starship moving around in some snow. Interaction with curb space management systems. We're developing approaches to managing our curb space for vehicles and interactions across this curb space. These start to become relevant, especially if they're deployed from the curb, which they might be from other vehicles. Spatial assignment, where do we want them at what time? Occupancy pricing. Basically, there's a value to being in the public or semi-public realm. How do we price that, right? Otherwise, if we don't price it, what signal are we sending? Interactions between PMRs and temporary traffic controls or closed and restricted street segments. The Urban Robotics Foundation speaks to a staged approach to managing deployment, 5-stage from discovery to wait and see approach to governance, research and development, and then into deployments, stages of deployment. And I think it's fair to say that the example of things that have gone wrong didn't get past, stage 2 and hit an accessibility wall because the work hadn't been done to ensure that key things had been addressed. And so they're coming back now, right? They're looping back. And so when we start to talk about are we ready, we should be asking ourselves, where are we on this continuum? And what do we need to proceed? Like I said, discovery is really about learning. Preparation is budgeting, proposing, testing, floating the idea and making sure that people are ready for it. And then you move into different levels of deployment. We're not there yet, but we can't go directly to it. So I'm going to wrap this up. Conclusions. The business cases for deploying PMRs are improving. And so we're going to see them at some point, and we need to be preparing for that. We have applicable knowledge from the regulation of things like Uber, e-scooters, bike share, even newspaper boxes, but taking a wait and see approach to managing PMR deployment has not proven to be successful. So you can't sit on your butt. The the application of a disability lens or an accessibility lens to the development of PMR policies and regulations is going to be critical to addressing the significant risk that they could pose to vulnerable street users. If you can't address that, then why would you go any further? On the flip side, they could be very valuable if you get that right. And there's a lot of resource materials and opportunities for collaboration available via the Urban Robotics Foundation. And so I would urge people to check that out. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and we may or may not have some time for some questions.
We will open it up for questions, but I just want to thank Travis for coming by. Travis is one of my favorite engineers. I don't have a lot of them, but no, but I think Travis, if you ever need to feel humble, just invite Travis to come speak. Not only is he super smart, but if you play Trivia Pursuit with him, you will leave feeling very self-conscious. You're very good at Trivia Pursuit. Yeah, really good. It makes me uncomfortable. All right, so do we I have one question to start though, and you can even grab the mic out of there.
Okay.
And we'll look like a comedy duo. You'll be the straight man.
I'm ready.
So okay, so are you seeing the willingness in Calgary for policy to allow some of this to happen?
Yeah, I think so. I'll turn it around and say I'm not seeing anything that suggests that there's an unwillingness, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of interest in this as a development, technological, commercial. Calgary has traditionally been pretty open to that idea of trying things, right? I think the fact that it hasn't happened here is notable, right?
Yeah.
And so, no, I think we're open to it. But I think also we like to learn from others and try to, not just do the same thing over and over if it hasn't worked elsewhere. So I think, I know our policy group's already aware of this and has thought about it. Like I said, we have put a lot of work in over the years into the public realm and semi-public realm in any event. So we've been thinking about, how do we incorporate other technologies? So I think the groundwork's there.
Yeah.
But doing it right is what matters. And as long as we're committed to doing that, which I'm sure that we are, the city is, then that's the right approach.
And you use is it URF, the Urban Robotics Foundation?
Yes, Urban
Right.
Robotics Foundation.
And I think they saw like just the idea of getting some standards and policy that's the norm across other cities. I like that because if you look at even scooters, like the policy for scooters on road or on sidewalk is completely different between Edmonton and Calgary, right?
Yeah.
Here they're only on streets, they're only on sidewalks.
Well, and I should point out the Urban Robotics Foundation, of course, doesn't make policy, so that, that's always going to be the purview of the municipalities. But what they will do is they'll say they definitely have advanced the definition of standards, like the kind of standards that you have to have in place that are irrespective of municipality. And then they're advancing and facilitating the discussion and the understanding so that municipalities are prepared, right, and understand what it's going to take, along with everybody else, the providers, the potential service or commercial entities. So they're creating that space for understanding, but they definitely are focused on the standards and making sure that the technical standards exist that need to be there.
Nice. All right, any questions from the audience? Let's go, Conrad.
Hi, Travis.
Hi, Connor.
Thank you for that lovely presentation. Quick question around cost effectiveness. Do you have any data from the Urban Robotics Foundation about maybe, offsetting costs using this technology versus another?
Offsetting costs to commercial retailers? I don't have specific information on that. That's something I'd have to go and dig in and pursue. It's definitely identified as a potential benefit, so I think there's got to be something to that. There's certainly interest on the part of retailers and e-tailers to go that direction. I can tell you that there has been a look at the emission savings that result. There has been a look at energy that it takes to move, say, a 1 pound parcel, that final mile, so a lot of last mile type analysis. But specifically, I'd have to go in and take a look. But we could do that, Conrad.
Yeah, thanks.
That's great. You think of even the reduction in injuries to our postal workers if they didn't have to carry those heavy bags, right? All right, and they could walk faster. In the back. Sandra, oh, sorry, Larry. Good morning.
Hi, I'm Tita. I'm a business strategist from Calgary Transit. My question is around liability and around insurances. So for example, if you are using this vehicle to pilot from a technological point of view, I believe the TRL is still 2 to 4 in range in terms of commercializing it. So when you're testing it for the city, are you leasing it or are you owning it? Because if you're leasing it, has it been figured out if some accident happens or something, who's going to pay the insurance and things like that?
Yeah, great questions. To date, most of the deployments have been commercial entities unto themselves that have entered into agreements with the municipality. They've retained ownership of the devices. So the city has acted more in its traditional role of permitting or regulating the operation of a privately owned, in this case, robotic vehicle, interacting on city-controlled streets. But you're absolutely right. Like, liability is one of the major question marks that hasn't been worked through, let's say, in detail. Sometimes some of that takes experience, but the case where we saw pedestrians interacting with a robot that got stuck on the curb, for example, what if somebody hurts themselves trying to shift a robot? What if somebody, there was actually one example I saw where there was a gentleman who was working on a building and stepped back, contractor, to let a robot pass through, and then he's sort of like urging it along, kicking it with his foot. I mean, these are interesting physical interactions, but if somebody comes back at some point and says, I've actually sustained an injury as a result, the city will say, well, that has to be addressed with the private operator, but the insurance has to be there for that, and the city has to require that insurance be in place, right? And so I think we have models for that based on the things that are currently operating in our public right-of-way, like scooters, bike share and such. But, there's no guarantee that the arrangements that we have for those will be perfect or exactly appropriate for application to robots. And so a trial would be an opportunity to try to, if necessary, be overly conservative in terms of protecting the interests of everybody involved, and then figuring out how to peel it back to something that makes sense on that can be scaled up in the future. So I don't think it's insurmountable, but you're right. There's major questions there, and like I said, I will always watch the insurance industry and interest, out of interest, because I think they sometimes play a bigger role than we always perceive in terms of how these things go.
Yeah, and we have had living labs that have been autonomous vehicles, and I think we even had one on the sidewalk, a robot delivery as a living lab. So we do make sure that they have liability insurance. So that's one of the pieces for living labs. And then for the autonomous bus, I mean, that was one of our first living labs with Monique, Andrew Sador, and David Basto. And they delivered people from the Science Center to the zoo and back and forth. But that was 2017, 2018? Yep.
Where the autonomous shuttle ran in the tree when the operator was driving the vehicle. It was a gray area. It was not on a fixed route.
Right.
So after that, the whole autonomous pilot industry kind of shut down in Ontario because of the Norham incident.
Really? Yeah, well, see, and whereas the bus that we had, everybody's back, the bus that we had would stop for magpies and gophers and rabbits, right? So you've got 12 people on the bus, right? And it lurches to a stop. So I think that led to another living lab at the zoo where we had cameras taking pictures, thousands and thousands of pictures of the Canadian animals in the Wildlands exhibit. So we could understand which animals you stop for, moose, which ones maybe you consider not lurching people for. All right, there were some more questions. Sandra.
Of course. Do you know, is the Urban Robotics Foundation, are they collecting statistics on the number of vandalism, how many of these robots are being vandalized, the robots being stolen in its entirety, the payloads being stolen, any of those types of statistics to really warrant or offset the viability of having these robots?
I don't know if they are specifically, but I'm sure their members, which includes some of the robot providers and the service providers like Starship, are aware of that information. So it's possible that it's available, but we'd have to check with the Urban Robotics Foundation, in terms of themselves. I haven't looked for a report or study on that. I'd be interested in knowing too. I mean, we know with something like scooters, there's a certain degree of scooters that every year get tossed in the Bow River or otherwise get damaged or vandalized. I'm not sure how it changes when you get into something on the order of a personal delivery robot or something larger, right? But it's a good question, and I don't know specifically. I'm sorry.
Yes, of course.
One quick follow-up to the efficacy of these robots, and particularly, I have a background also in food safety, and so just considering that some foods have to be kept at like the hot food have to be kept at a certain temperature range, cold food, the same thing. Calgary has can have different weather fluctuations. So the comment would be is just that this would come under the purview, I suspect, of Alberta Health Services in having to deploy their inspectors to monitor these robots and also ensure that they are sanitized on a regular basis to prevent any pathogenic contamination or transfer of pathogens to further food deliveries.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure. A good point. Again, I think it would be basically the way it would relate would be, this is just a service similar to a driver skip the dishes. Obviously not the same, and with some situations where it could be very different. But the onus goes back to those who prepare the food in terms of how it's prepared and the services that are provided or they choose to use, and then the actual service provider who would have a performance contract, presumably with the restaurant, for example. So yeah, the city wouldn't be directly involved. The province would certainly be involved and concerned with how that works. But again, it's sort of an extension or a new version of something that we already have an existing model for, right? Mm-hmm. With skip the dishes, for example, that type of driver delivery. Some days I wonder if the stuff that gets delivered, to my door by a driver would be warmer if it came by robot. But nonetheless, I think these are things that have to be thought through. But there are existing frameworks, right? Regulatory frameworks that would probably require adjustments or tweaks, and then the enforcement piece and how do you enforce it? And that's going to be a very different wrinkle. And on a broad level, I mean, if you have a large number of PMRs operating in a given municipality, that could really change the resourcing required, right, to keep up with it, for sure.
Yeah, I think that robot on screen would be a prime target for the raccoon gangs in Ottawa, right? Like, do you think they'd soon learn that there's a good meal in there? Christopher?
From the definition of the PMR, it sounds like it would also apply to larger scale, apart from like the smaller delivery robots, but eventually to medium-sized, full-sized semis, buses, and taxis. Do you see that the industry is trying to use the lessons learned from the mini delivery robots to be able to apply to larger ones, vice versa, as well as URF's role within it all?
There's definitely an element of, let's apply the lessons, certainly from delivery robots to other forms of PMRs. I don't think the PMR definition is intended to get into street running vehicles per se, autonomous street vehicles. So I would make the differentiation there. So when you hop to the other side of the curb, if you will, you're probably into a different area of responsibility. And certainly in behavior on the street, that dynamic, it changes, right? Traffic Act and everything. But that being said, you can get some really big potential robots that still fit this definition. And you might have a 50-pound Starship, but if you can go to 250 pounds, I mean, I was thinking about that, that's like getting tackled, right? If something was to run into you. So there's just a lot of mass and potential momentum there. It does change some of the considerations in terms of, how do you manage the potential for collisions and the energy that could be involved, and where should these things be going? But fundamentally, you're coming back to the question of you're operating in public or semi-public space, public or semi-public realm, typically sidewalk type thing. So what's appropriate behavior in that environment, right? And then how do we ensure that these robots can follow what we deem to be appropriate? We have to first be able to define it, and then make sure that they know or are contractually obligated or in a regulatory environment are required through regulation to behave that way. And then we have to be able to enforce it, right? And so, if nothing else, the amount of energy involved with a larger robot makes that even more important. But again, those little ones look like pretty good trip hazards too. I don't want to be going over them as well. So it's a challenge, and I think what we'll see is that delivery robots, because of their commercial appeal and the business cases behind them, are the vanguard. But what will follow, we'll apply the lessons learned from those as we see what else comes through. And this is not going to be hey, we've got it fixed, we've got it sorted, we know exactly what we're doing now, and any PMRs that want to come in and go through, we haven't had that experience as a city operating our public spaces. It's not going to be the experience here with PMRs. These regulations are going to have to evolve over time. There's going to be learnings, and even the Urban Robotics Foundation they recognize that their guides are going to change over time, and so we really need to share knowledge. And I'm also struck by the fact that somebody from City of Airdrie might be listening to this, going, well, we haven't seen any PMRs on our street yet, but when that happens, we don't have maybe the same experience that the City of Calgary or we don't have the same experience that the City of Toronto has. So we need to, as municipalities, we need to share, right? Share information, share experiences, so that we don't have to learn all the same lessons, over and over. That's the other thing that strikes me, when I consider your question. Yeah,
that's great. Travis, thanks again. We're so lucky to have you on the URF and being a part of these global discussions. You're going to speak here again, lots more, I'm sure. So we'll bring you back in when you've got, when we have our first robot on the streets. That'd be great. And with that, I just want to say thanks, and we're going to take a 10-minute break. So.